Welcome to Three Distinct Knocks. I'm Nicholas Harvey.
And I'm David Riley. And
I'm Brother Bryan Godwin from California and Anchor Bell Lodge, UD.
It's like you didn't read what we were going to do. We
I
had this
know.
whole thing.
we had it planned. Well, go ahead and read the rest
All
of
right,
this
well,
resume.
that's Brother Bryan Godwin out of California. Bongo Zim on Reddit. He is a member of Culver City Fauché Lodge number 467. He is also the charter member and senior warden of one of the newest lodges in California, Anchor Bell Lodge. Scottish Rite, York Rite, Commander. He's in everything. He is Bro Bryan Godwin on Facebook and Instagram, if you've seen his awesome pages. He also has a blog at freemasonlifestyle.com. All of this will be in the description down below. He's written in the Scottish Rite Research Society's Plumline magazine. He's written in the Masonic Society's The Journal. He was in Southern California Research Lodge's The Fraternal Review magazine.
Is that something we should subscribe to, Nick?
Yes, for $25 a year, you get it in your inbox. $35 a year, you get a great magazine to your house. 11 months out of the year or something. And the English online journal Crossed Keys. He is really well known for the Copiale Manuscript. Now, you're going to, well, not you because you know everything, but most people would be like, the hell is that? And I would be like, to be honest, I don't know. So here he is to tell us about it. So Bryan, thank you for joining. Floor is yours.
Well, thanks for having me. My pleasure to be here again and hopefully shed a little light on the Copiale Manuscript. So it's not surprising that not very many people know about this because it is the most recent Masonic document to come to light. That being because it was only translated and decoded in 2012. Pretty much every other document that we study and peel apart and work on has, been in our possession for a minimum of 50 years, if not longer, which means Masonic pundits, researchers, and historians have torn apart every document there is. In the case of the Copiale manuscript, we haven't had that long to look at it, and not very many people have really delved into the transcription and translation to see how it relates to Masonry. This document was originally found in the early 70s in East Germany in a library, and it is a 103-page handwritten document that contains a bunch of essentially gibberish. There are Roman characters, there are symbols, there are logograms, there are pictograms with no spaces and a total stream of consciousness seeming manner of being written. When it was first found, it got passed around to lots of cryptographers and people who really get into old dusty manuscripts and that kind of thing. And the encryption on this document was so strong that it was even considered to be a hoax. It was kind of up there with the crypto sculpture, with the Voynich manuscript, with the Zodiac Killer's cipher. This is in the top 5 most strong encrypted documents known ever. And for, basically 40-ish years, it eluded getting decoded. The document itself kind of can be broken down into 3 distinct sections. The first part of the document is the Order of the Oculists, which just defines and sort of transcribes a ritual of a possible guild of eye doctors. Sort of random and strange thing to be in one of the most densely and strongly encoded documents known to man. It then gets into a sort of first-person point of view from the author and gets into a bit of a political discourse and also gets into either a paramasonic or anti-masonic commentary and makes some very audacious claims about the origins of the premier Grand Lodge of England. That's a topic that's been hotly debated lately, what with our 300th anniversary either having had happened or about to be happening. It really supports some viewpoints on that in some ways. And then last, the third section is a series of exposés. There's a basic expose of the first 3 degrees of Masonry. There's what was once believed to be a very early version of the Scots Master degree. And then 2 degrees that have never been seen before nor again, called the Lodge of Consolidation and the Key Lodge, which I believe actually correlate quite a bit to early Scottish Rite ritual, which we can get into a little bit more on. But that's kind of the encapsulation of the document. And most people sort of pass it over. They say, oh, it's about a bunch of eye doctors. But really, there's a whole lot more to it that's far more interesting and important than the first section. And we can kind of break this down one by one and give a bit more in-depth overview of those 3 sections. So just to kind of talk a little bit about the decryption and how this happened. It was decrypted by a professor at USC, Kevin Knight. He was giving a presentation at a conference on machine learning. And he ran into a professor named Christiane Schaefer. She's from Sweden. And she was intrigued by how he was talking about using machine learning to translate odd languages like Farsi and other pictographic type languages, and being able to use computers to recognize symbols and then context to be able to make accurate translation of printed materials from languages that kind of elude the typical translation matrices that we have these days. So after the conference, Christiane goes up to him, and it's funny, she had received it from a colleague a decade before. It had confounded her. Her colleague was in Rome at the time, and they were sitting in a cafe, and he said, "Oh well, this document here, it really just it's the kind of thing that maybe some cold Swedish nights will allow you to spend some time to crack this thing," and kind of slides it across the table.
Yes, there's nothing.
Well, she never got anywhere with it, and so after the conference, she goes up to Kevin or Dr. Knight, and she goes, "Lots of isolation and long Swedish nights have done nothing to shed light on this manuscript. Perhaps the Southern California sun can help shed the light it needs." And she's like, "Here's the top secret manuscript," and slides it over to Kevin. So, this guy's absolutely brilliant and a maverick in the area of machine translation and computer learning. And he decides, okay, I'm gonna get into this. So he looks into it, and it's exactly how I described, with these different logograms and pictograms, and then a bunch of Roman letters. The first thing you try and do is find patterns when you're decrypting things. And he noticed that there was sort of a repeating pattern, or at least some distribution of Roman letters. And he thought, oh, okay. And by Roman letters, I mean A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. And he said, well, that must be where the actual, code lies. And so he tried deciphering that, and he got nowhere with that. And then he realized, oh, no, that's not the code. Those are actually just line breaks or spaces. So each one of those A, B, C, D, E, F, G letters was completely random, meant nothing, and meant that there was a break between words. And that was the first piece of the puzzle that he needed to be able to start to piece things together. Well, without getting further into detail, what he realized that he had on his hands was likely a homophonic code or substitution cipher that basically uses different symbols to represent one letter. So if you're dealing with S or E or T or letters that are very common, you want to flatten the distribution of that by representing them with 5 or 6 different symbols, meaning that there could be 5 or 6 different things that could translate to T. And furthermore, some of the logograms or icons could really mean anything and were not phonetic in nature at all. So he got to getting his machines working on this. He's actually on vacation in Hawaii, and this is what nerdy guys like Dr. Knight do, but stayed up all night working on this. And he had a sense that this might have a preference for German, because there are only 2 plain text inscriptions. One is Copiale 3, which is handwritten, which is where we get the name of the manuscript from. And the other is Philip, 1866. And it's Philip with 2 P's, Phillipp, which is an old German spelling for Philip. So he put into his code like, hey, maybe this is German. And it cranked away and cranked away and cranked away. And all of a sudden, the first crack in the armor appeared, and he got a translation that said, Der Kandidat antwortet. The candidate answers. And he knew all of a sudden, this is not a hoax, but something really interesting. So he continued to work on it until the entire thing was translated, and it realized that, in fact, it was German, and Old German at that, or High German. So once he had everything broken down, that had to be translated into English to make any sense. Now, of course, Dr. Knight was not a member of any fraternal society, has no background in historical stuff with regards to that, but he knew he had something with relation to fraternal societies. And that kind of brings us to the first section, which is about the Order of the Oculus. The Oculus ostensibly were an actual operative guild that did exist from 1740 to 1760, very small, one town that had this group of people in it. And it outlines essentially a degree or a ritual. And in some ways, it could be very reminiscent to things that Masons have been through. There's a series of obligations. There are modes of recognition. I'll read you a quick little translation of one of it, but he carries him thereafter to a secondary table where, next to a lot of candles, several instruments and eyeglasses, microscopic and perspective instruments lie. A cloth and a glass of water must be present. He lowers himself onto a low stool and he looks at an unwritten piece of paper for a while. If after a while he answers that he cannot see anything written on there, then the master of ceremonies puts a pair of eyeglasses and asks him again if he is not able to read the writing. The answer is no. During this time, the master of ceremonies comforts him as good as he can and raises his hopes for improvement as he washes his eyes with a cloth. And if nothing helps, he will announce that they will proceed with the operation. He then goes on to take some instruments and pretend to pluck at his eyes and that kind of thing. But in the meantime, they make a swap and they say, now can you read? And it's like, well, you've now been brought to light and can receive the information of this decree. And then it kind of goes on from there a little bit to do the series of obligations and modes of recognition and that kind of thing that all would sound very familiar. The interesting thing about these kind of translations are that there's a lot of words that we use in Masonry that mean totally different things, right? Like Tyler, to us is a guy who sits outside a room with a sword. To most people would be somebody who puts the floor in your bathroom. So if you kind of play around with a few of these words and mix them up, it is possible that this first portion of the manuscript is actually a blind of sorts to preserve a Masonic ritual potentially. The reason that some people think that, and the few people who have looked into this document all kind of agree that it's just sort of odd that this very little known group of eye doctors, and it's an operative guild, would have an elaborate introduction to their ceremonies, although that wasn't unheard of. But if that's the case, why is it so hard encrypted? And there's also...
Sure. And what year was this written about?
Well, we don't know for sure. My personal thought about it is in the 1750s, roughly.
Oh, okay.
Some people have proposed 1730, some people have proposed later. And I think that, in my research, I've come to the conclusion that it is between 1750 and 1753. And through primary sources, we can substantiate those dates. But it does beg the question, why is this in here? And it's an interesting read, and if you want to read more about it, I'd be happy to send portions of the translation because it's just kind of a fun ceremony. But even many secret societies like to use jokes in their encryption and when they're trying to bury things. And I do think there's something funny about a blind guy being brought to light by a bunch of eye doctors. And those are just the types of jokes that would happen in the mid-18th century when trying to actually hide a ritual from prying eyes. And we do know that there was a lot of anti-Masonic sentiment going on in Prussia, what would become Germany later, in and around that time, and so much that even by 1786, they outright banned all secret societies. So the idea that they're trying to bury some information here, both through encryption and a blind, is not unheard of with other manuscripts. So there's definitely a possibility that there's more than meets the eye, so to speak, with this first section of the document. So as interesting as that is,
In your opinion as a Mason, how Masonic does it feel?
Very. It has all of the elements. in the beginning, the guy is blindfolded. He's led into a room. He's surrounded by other members of the lodge. He's knelt at an altar. He's given, a ceremony of being brought to light to be able to see. He's, then bound to the fraternity through an obligation. It's definitely similar enough. But then again,
do you think there's a parallel universe where members of the Order of Oculus are sitting around discussing this weird manuscript about stonemasons?
That's very possible. I mean, look, like we have the Order of Free Gardeners. I mean, there's so many fraternal societies, the Mopses, all these guys. There's just a ton of stuff going on in the mid 18th century that it could be, but I think the rest of the document is much more interesting, quite honestly. And I think that a lot of current people, they sort of stop there because it's long. It's 103 pages of text. And, they're like, oh, cool. Yeah, cool. Eye doctor thing. That's it.
Right. Well, that's all I knew about it before, I read your outline.
Yeah. And guys I admire who are much stronger historians than me, that they basically stop there and say either, no, this is a Masonic blind, or, hey, that's a cool thing. And that's like all that's kind of written about it for the most part, with one exception. But it gets weirder. It gets really weird, actually. And the second section is by far the weirdest of the whole thing. And, basically it switches from, here's how you initiate somebody into the Order of Oculus, to kind of a rant. And it's definitely in a first person author type of flow, like almost a journal type of thing. And this is where it definitely gets interesting. And when you're doing research, you try to ask questions, right? Like the questions about this document that we'd want to try and solve are, who wrote it? Why was it written? When was it written? Why was it so deeply encrypted? And what impact does that information have once revealed, right? Like those are kind of our questions that we're going to put out there to try and solve. And in section 2, we sort of get an actual little bit of an idea of who this author is. We get a bit of his personality. We see in his writing, who he was, and he seems kind of like a little bit of a bitter guy. And that does kind of lead to a little bit of answering that question somewhat. So he gets into this section, and the author starts to talk about the true secrets of Freemasonry. So, and that's where my ears went, like, like true secrets of Freemasonry. Let's find out what that is. And he goes on to basically recount the meeting of 4 lodges to form the premier Grand Lodge of England, except he has a completely different story about it. He goes on to essentially say that, these 4 people got together to see if they could start something just to see if people would join, and go on and create a series of arbitrary signs and symbols and intrigue and secrets that don't even exist, to see how far someone would push themselves to try and find out the secrets. So I'll actually read the text, and he says, the real secret of our present flourishing order is to entrust the arrangement of Freemasonry in the form of a real secret, to commit every member to the secret intentions stated in the 5th title, that nobody should know about the secret institution or the origins of Freemasonry. And then it kind of goes on to be ours and remain a true and still undiscovered secret. Okay. And then, sorry, I don't usually do this stuff from papers, but when I'm actually reading from a manuscript, I kind of need to. Hang on a sec here.
No problem.
The true secret is namely about the story or origin of the Masonic order. Curiosity is inherited with mankind. Frequently, we want to know something only because it needs to be kept secret. Once, a few good friends came to talk about this subject in England. and each of them gave examples of an order of curiosity driven too far. They're talking about other societies or other things that happened in the past. And finally, they came to think about creating a fraternity about whose only intention would be for people to be accepted and know about the purpose in order to see how many of the impertinences he would apply to enter the order without knowing beforehand what they would be bound to. They would agree immediately. They would like to pretend that a great secret would be behind their unification and decided to come up with certain arbitrary signs by which a brother should recognize each other. But due to the fact that time did not allow it to be all arranged, another appointment was set, and that's when the Guild of Freemasons was set up and its name ascribed. Kind of a bombshell, if true. Certainly the only primary source we have is this man's opinion. So it could be a totally unsubstantiated, unimportant anti-Masonic bit of fodder, or not. So, you know, we have a lot of recent research that has cast a lot of doubts on this origin story. You know, we know that the Apple Tree Tavern, where a lot of this was supposed to take place, didn't exist at the time in 1717. Certainly Anderson's constitutions have been proven to be whimsical or romantic history at best for the most part. Anderson was basically paid for his 1723 constitutions to write them. You know, and then he goes on to revise them later in 1738, you know, and he cuts out a lot of stuff there. So, you know, there's reason to at least consider that there may be some credence here. And there's another passage that comes after that, that's sort of in the same political rant section, where he goes on to just kind of complain about Freemasons and how they're growing. And, you know, he alludes to specifically since the year 100, well, it's the year 1723, since the Duke of Montague had gotten this idea. And that lends a little bit more credence in actual written documentation from the 1750s that perhaps the Duke of Montague was in fact the person who put forth the idea of creating at least this facade of a Grand Lodge. We know that the Grand Lodge didn't do much. You know, there were lodges, there was masonry way before this, right? But, you know, they kind of got together and tried to put an aristocratic face onto the fraternity, but they didn't really control the subsequent lodges around there for years. They didn't actually coalesce for a long time. So I find it really interesting that there is specific primary sourced information that says, hey, Duke of Montague in 1723 got this idea and made it happen. You know, again, it's in the past tense. So, you know, is it his wishful thinking? Is it fact? There's no knowing for sure, but it certainly leads me to think that, well, maybe there is a really good reason that this was so hard encoded and difficult to decrypt.
What difference does that make? Let's say it is true.
Well, I mean, that's a kind of a different topic. Does it make a difference for what we do? No, not to me. I think it is important, however, to acknowledge authentic history versus romantic history and know which is which and celebrate both. You know, our entire fraternity is based on romantic history and allegory, and it's extremely important. That's how we imprint wise and serious truths upon each other. But, you know, we should know where the romance is and where the facts are.
So his claim is that Freemasonry didn't exist prior to the establishment of the Premier Grand Lodge?
I don't believe so, but there's no knowing, because I don't know what's going through his head other than this translation.
Right.
But he
makes it sound like Freemasonry was invented at the meeting where the primary.
That's exactly what it sounds.
And we know that's not true.
Completely. We know that, you know, there's speculative masonry going back into Scotland, and there were, you know, modes of recognition and things like that. But we also know that in England, you know, all of a sudden in 1723, everybody's rushing to join. You know, it's explosive. It goes from like, you know, a real underground thing that we don't really know that much about. We know it existed, to this public thing that happens.
Well, there's two things going on there. Well, at least two. One is that there was a huge fad for societies at that point. Mm-hmm. And the absence of TV and radio and any other form of entertainment helping to promote, you know, you might as well go out for dinner with a group of your friends and call it the Beef Eating Society or whatever.
Right.
The other thing is, it is the Duke of Montagu. You know, nobility, the aristocracy, for better or worse, and that's, I leave it to other people to make that decision. I have my opinion, were fad leaders of the day. And so once you get someone of his prestige involved, it would be more attractive to people, right? That's a reasonable assumption.
Absolutely. I think the only thing of interest is whether, you know, we can eliminate Sayers and Payne and Desaguliers as the first 3 Grand Masters before Montagu or not. And I think that that particular line, if we exclude the conversation about the 4 Grand Lodges getting together to see if they could make a curiosity go further, you know, is interesting at the least.
No, it's absolutely interesting. I'm just trying to figure out what it affects and how we think, you know.
I think it gives credence and support to Prescott and Mitchell's theories that anything before 1723 is hogwash in regards to the creation of the Premier Grand Lodge, which has nothing to do with the creation of Masonry.
Right. So the creation of the Premier Grand Lodge, it potentially has its own mythical story about its creation, just like Masonry does.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I kind of subscribe to that. You know, I think that there was this idea to try and create a Grand Lodge, and there probably were some guys who got together and said, let's go mainstream with this, and let's put an aristocratic face on it, and, you know, let's make our little thing that has been percolating for hundreds of years into a big thing and see if we can get people to join. And I think Montagu was the first, and I think it might have been his idea. I can't prove that. I do think this factoid adds credence to it, though. Right. But again, you know, it's mostly because what could be of a lot of value in this document is written correlation, and I'm not calling it causation, correlation with the recent stuff that's come to light through Prescott and Mitchell.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, the thing about this is the document's broken up into phonetic stuff that can be translated, but then there are these icons that stand for whole words very clearly, and those whole words, you know, that icon could represent 10 different words for all we know, and it could be representing Freemasons, it could be representing the Gormogans, you know, and he's talking about a society that got together to, you know, make arbitrary signs and symbols. You know, other parts of the document contextually, those icons do seem to say Freemasonry. It kind of fits very well, but there's no way to prove any of those because we don't have a key. There's no Rosetta Stone for the Copiale. We were able to get all of the phonetic stuff down, but the logograms and icons, you know, we have to kind of take our best guess with.
Right.
So, it's fun and interesting, and I do think that it is pertinent to a lot of the research that's going on now. But again, that's only another piece of the puzzle that is in this document. And in the 3rd section is a series of exposés, and I think the biggest breakthrough in the document is contained in here. It has a full expose of the first 3 degrees of Masonry that we, you know, can omit because it's basically a typical series of knocks and columns and staircases and checkered floors and passwords and things that align with other exposés that are sometime in the middle of the 18th century. And, you know, they're pretty bang on probably were copied from something. You know, if someone was to make a database of old manuscripts that we could end up putting search terms in and cross-reference, I could probably figure out which one.
Oh, come on, man. What? Gosh. Damn, dude.
That's an interesting idea, though.
No,
yeah, it's a good idea, isn't it?
No, those exposés are out there, and they're. I've read a number of different exposés, and it's an interesting thought that the primary purchasers of the early exposés were Masons who wanted help with their memory work.
Right.
And it's interesting to me the way that some of the differences between them propagated.
Right.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah,
No,
that's
definitely.
what Bob Davis said when I told him about that idea.
Yeah, it's good stuff. But again, I mean, we have so many that portion's
Right.
not actually that interesting. I mean, it's cool, but it's not that interesting. And after the first 3 degrees, he then moves on to talking about the Scots Master degree, and he gives a very thorough overview, and then compares the German ritual to the French ritual on a first-person point of view. And it was initially proposed, actually, in the plumb line by Dr. Onefors, that perhaps this was a very early version of the Scots Master, if not possibly the first recorded document of the Scots Master. And at the time, the Copiale was being, sort of pegged in around 1730, which would make that very interesting. But there are 2 substantive dates to refute the idea of the 1730s working for this document's dating. The first is there's actually mention of 1745 as an event in the past in the manuscript itself. So we know it's certainly after 1745. But with a little help from Joseph Wages, I got a copy of the Berlin Scots Master ritual from 1750, also known as the Écossais Prusse Scots Master ritual. And it's almost word for word. It's really darn close. Like certain passages are actually like the same exact words from that manuscript that shows the Scots Master. So, we can kind of say, okay, well, we know for sure after 1745, it's almost like a word-for-word copy from the Prusse Écossais, and that's 1750. So it's probably after 1750.
But is it possible that the sections are not, like the document may have been written on a wall all at one time, but the sections could have been compiled separately?
Completely. We have no idea. This journal could be, a 30-year undertaking.
Right.
We don't know, but we do know that these portions at least can be ascribed to a date.
Right.
We have a previously existing manuscript that matches up with this one, and that's why I started looking at the first 3 degree exposés to see if there was, like, does it match Postboy? Does it match, Pritchard's? Any of these? And I couldn't really get quite enough of a fit there, but I was able to nail down the Scots Master section pretty accurately. So I think we can get pretty close that we know it's after 1750. But there are 2 other degrees that are described in here that are unique and don't exist in anything else that we've uncovered. And they're called, it's a description of something called a key lodge and a consolidation lodge. Now, I got some access, again, Joe Wade has helped me with a lot of this research because he's got a bunch of unpublished stuff that he was willing to share. And he's been working on a translation of the Belo manuscript, including all the tracing boards that go with it. And I think that book's going to be coming out probably in next year's Herodom. I know Art's working on it with him. But if you take the key lodge and kind of combine it with this consolidation lodge, it starts to look a whole lot like a blueprint for the 23rd degree of Masonry, or key of Masonry, also known as Knight of the Sun. And when you reference it with Franken's system, Order of the Royal Secret, a lot of the themes are the same. There are icons that are in both. There are caduceuses and 3 snakes placed in a hieroglyphic way from one document to the other. There are descriptions of alchemy. The 23rd degree, or key of Masonry, Knight of the Sun, goes on to be basically our current 28th degree, which has kind of been watered down a bit from Pike's 27th degree. And you can see a progression, but all 3 of them contain these ideas about political justice and alchemy and truth and good citizenship. And the key lodge described in the Copiale has all of those things in it. The consolidation portion is a very short segment that just says, this is a alchemical degree that is talking about the fixation of mercury. and the fixation of Mercury is a prominent but small point of the 23rd degree or key of Masonry. So we've got the key lodge, the key of Masonry. We've got similar themes, we've got similar icons. We've got this alchemical degree mentioned in the same passage. And it seems to correlate that this could be a proto degree that led to potentially the consolidation of all of this in the Belo manuscript, which was a predecessor to Franken's work, which eventually goes to Etienne Morin, and then that goes over to America, and then we have our modern day Scottish Rite from there. And if true, this could be pretty important in that we can see like a firsthand account of somebody who's this person. We get back to the who, right? Like, who wrote this? Obviously had a lot of knowledge of Masonry, access to exposés. He's also writing in a first person point of view. I saw, I experienced at this lodge, this happened. So he had access to all kinds of things that were going on in Germany. And we know that these degrees were just percolating in the 1750s. They weren't established. But that being said, we know that Knight of the Sun gets really codified by 1753 in the Belo. So that really does answer another question of when. We are pretty sure this is somewhere between 1750 and 1753. It's a pretty narrow window and accurate enough to give us a sense of when this document was written, or at least when a good portion of the document was written.
Well, that's when it was finished, at least, right? Right,
exactly. Or at least when it was finished, or at least when the portions, that relate to these dated sources that we can compare to were written. So
yeah, fair enough. The portions we can't date at all could have been either before or after. I keep thinking that they would be before, but that's a fair point.
And it's very possible and even very likely. We also know if the ritual of the Oculus has anything to do with the operative guild, they existed a short period of time between 1740 and 1760, which kind of puts this right square in the middle, right? Like we know for sure there's a date of 1745 referenced in the past. And he's talking about one of the Jacobite rebellions in that particular instance. And that's a definite, like we know at least that portion was written 1745 or later. But I don't know. I mean, is it a blind for a Masonic ritual in section 1, or maybe they really had this ritual? But either way, we've gotten a lot closer to a definitive date of when the text was produced. The questions that remain, of course, we really don't know who the author is. There is.
Well, we know he's a past master. He said he was bitter because he's
exactly. There's a thin thread of lineage that Andreas Onefors found of one Philip Beaumont, who was an oculist to some royalty in the 1750s. But the Philip it says 1866, so most likely whoever the Philip was that inscribed that plain text inscription, was just another owner. He was probably just another researcher that came across it in 1866 and wrote his name in the book. And that kind of leaves us with the final question. Copiales 3, loosely translates to copy in Galatian. And, is it the third copy? Are there more of these out there? Possibly.
It raises the question of, a lot of lodges number their rituals. It could just be that they were keeping track of who had copy 3. Mm-hmm. It could be that this is part 3 of something. Mm-hmm. That 1 and 2 are missing.
But this guy,
you need to answer these questions, Brian. Hurry up.
But this guy took so many things and made an encryption that worked, and then he took all these things and compiled them together. Well, why?
Well, the encryption part of it, encryption was a trending fad in some circles during this time period. Yeah. It was part of and interesting enough, it was trending in sort of the occult esoteric community as well. Spy work was really working with encryption more. It was developing as a science. So a lot of
Did I lose you guys?
well, it seems a rather random collection.
It is very random. It's a very odd document. It really, truly is. And you're right about encryption being a fad. How he nailed this one to be so hard, who knows? So hard to say. I had
that could just be luck.
It could be. It could. Well, no, but cryptographically, like there's very intentional steps taken to flatten the distribution and make it hard. The fact that there are so many characters representing specifically common letters. That's an intentional. It's not like it was unknown to do that using homophonic ciphers. It was a thing, but it was intentionally made to be hard. But I had an earlier hypothesis. I've been researching this for 3-4 years now. That maybe this document was much later and had something to do with the Illuminati, because they had their own cipher, and a big part of the Minerval class was learning the cipher and being able to write fluently in it. And in addition, in their degrees, they have a degree that is kind of similar to this Oculus degree. They have a Scots Master degree. They've got the 3 degrees of Masonry in there, and it's sort of tied up neatly in a bow. But unfortunately, to be a good researcher, you have to be able to, kill your darlings and backtrack when you're faced with dates that are pretty firm and far more provable than, the hypothesis that I wished it was.
I think I think the most intriguing aspect of it for me, now that I know more about it, isn't the rituals. It isn't the specific content so much. It's like, what was the purpose of putting this together like this? Like, it doesn't have an obvious story that the various sections relate.
Right. So you mentioned sections. Is it with whatever they found, however it is, was it like a book or was it like random pieces of paper?
It's a book. It looks a lot like the type of high quality journal that you could purchase that was blank.
Sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It is the same handwriting throughout. It definitely feels like it's written at once in terms of when you look at the actual document. It doesn't mean that it was, but it feels that way.
Well, at least it's suggestive that it was within one person's lifetime, right?
Absolutely. It's absolutely one author, without question. Or at least maybe he's copying several.
Well, that's the other possibility, right? Because I was just thinking, that would not be the first time that part of joining an organization was to copy the thing.
Right. It's a great idea. It could possibly be the case. And, it's certainly something to try and look into while trying to define who the author is. I'm not sure, unless we find parts 1 and 2 or copies 1 and 2, that we'll have any idea of the provenance of this and where it came from. I think the best we can do is kind of lock on to a time period and a date with a little bit of certainty, and then extract a couple of, somewhat profound and important origins, right? Like, perhaps the 1723 Duke of Montague thing does support Prescott and Mitchell's work in a very early document, which would be a substantial thing if it could be proven to do that. And then, for those of us who are trying to piece together the origins of all the high degrees, if this is in fact a pre-Balo Knight of the Sun, that's very significant, because it gives us an idea of what the early workings of degrees were, because they changed and evolved, and this guy handed them to this guy, and this guy sold them to that guy, and he added his own thing, and then Pike rewrote them all. And it gives some insight into what was going on with the whole degree explosion that was happening at the time, and particularly to see something so prototypical and embryonic is of great interest to me, and probably to others who are trying to plot the course of how these degrees came into.
Well, the Knight of the Sun degree, one of my favorites, but it has.
Can you really say that?
Yeah, well,
you've taken
really good.
Hold on. That's not what I mean. I've taken like 45 degrees. Lord only knows, because I
That
know
sounds
you don't
clandestine
remember
to
how many
me.
degrees.
I don't know.
But the Knight of the Sun stands out in the Scottish Rite system. It stands out as well in those places where it's still conferred. It stands out as a particularly dense and important degree. And I think it's interesting that it's the thing that is in this early manuscript. You don't have a lot here. You certainly don't have a 33-degree system.
Oh no. I mean, there wasn't. I mean,
Right.
we're talking about 23 degrees and earlier, right? So
Right. Well, or a 99-degree system, or you have just a few. It's interesting that it's in there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it plays into being able to date and locate where this happened. Like we know this is probably in Berlin, right? Like it may be La Union, it could be any one of those like main lodges that were spreading degrees at the time. But the inclusion of the Scots Master degree being a very accurate expose, and then this prototypical Knight of the Sun. Gives us an idea of when and what was going on, at least for that section. The third section is probably, for me, actually the most interesting. I mean, it's kind of fun to talk about, do we just bust the mythology of the, creation of the premier Grand Lodge of England? Like maybe it's kind of neat, even if it's just, he's just harassing people, but why is he writing it down here in this encrypted thing? Like, he seems, the tone feels like the person believed it. It's certainly not written in plain English, like, hey, everyone who joined, this is the bullshit that happened. It's not. It's like, this is a secret. This is our secret. This is my secret. This is my secret information to encrypt, and that makes it interesting.
Yeah, it at least gives us the opportunity to review the origin of the Grand Lodge system, should we ever decide to change that.
Right. Exactly. And meanwhile, Scotland's sitting over there like,
yeah,
who needs it?
Grand Lodge? We don't need no stinking Grand Lodge. Yeah. I can't, like every Mason who nerds out on this stuff, I'm fascinated by the Oculus ritual, just because it's so not. I mean, it is both. It both has enough Masonic semblance, but it's different enough to be interesting too. I'm waiting to see, when someone's going to set up an Oculus lodge.
I like it.
It's just an interesting idea. So there really was an operative guild of Oculists.
Yes, there was.
This place,
we
know
that
that
they had rituals is unknown.
Yeah.
No proof.
Do we have any idea of like how big it was?
Very small, one town. I don't have a number of members, and I'm not sure if there is one, but it was very short-lived, and it was operative. It was a guild.
And it was tiny.
And it was small. Yeah.
Probably, yeah. So if it didn't last long, it probably, if they had thousands of members, it would have lasted longer.
Yeah, exactly. Which it just seems, that's sort of why it's just odd. Like why is that included in here? And why is it so hard and coded, other than you're right about the fad part of it? It's just sort of an anomaly. I mean, the whole thing is an anomaly. And
why is it included with the other stuff that is explicitly Masonic?
Exactly, which makes the idea of this thing being a sort of Masonic, paramasonic document, or anti-Masonic document.
But it makes it weird too, because I mean, if it was a blind, then why include in the same cipher the
stuff that's
the
not
exposés of the 3 degrees? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
I agreed. It's a good point. It's been very quickly dismissed as a blind, and I'm not certain that it is, but I'm not certain what it is either. I'm not certain that there is this like really highly organized ritualistic guild of eye doctors. I mean, maybe there were. I mean, we had a highly organized, highly ritualistic guild of little tiny dogs called the Mopses. I mean,
yeah, I have a special fondness for them. I almost have to wonder. I think every Mason at some point has sat down and been like, if I was going to write a ritual, what would the ritual look like? maybe it's just an experiment.
Yeah, but to find an oculist who was a Mason, and he found other how many oculists can be in one little city? But then even that, and then they're like, "Hey, let's do this thing," and then everyone was like, "Maybe," or maybe he just did it by himself. But then this guy supposedly creates a super hard cipher that the best cryptographers or whatever in the world and computers can't figure it out for however long. Wouldn't we have seen his encryption somewhere else if he? Because clearly he's a super smart dude.
Well, and clearly, I mean, given the access that he had to things, he was deeply involved in Freemasonry.
Definitely.
Or at least he was deeply enough involved to know stuff.
Yeah.
Which is interesting too. So who do we know who was who do we know who had an interest in mathematics, who was an oculist or interested in that kind of thing? Didn't have to be an oculist, could be a lens grinder, could be someone who just messed around with that kind of thing, who had a real interest in mathematics, who was a Mason. Bryan?
Let's see if I have my little.
Are you going to come up with an answer?
I feel like you just emailed the Grand Lodge of Prussia.
A small thought about it. Again, I mentioned there's this inscription, Philip 1866 with 2 P's. Who's Philip? The only thread that we have is Philip Frederick Steinhell, who's a German diplomat and is the first master of Frankfurt Lodge of La Union. Steinhell got his lodge recognized by London, and his sponsor from London that got his lodge chartered or warranted was Brother Beaumont, who was the oculist to the Prince of Wales.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. That's kind of, it's like, what do we have? We have a Philip who's a Mason with tight connections to an oculist who's a Mason. Like, that's it. That's all I've been able to find.
Gosh. This is what, because of that other project that I'm working on with the 3 things, it blows my mind that we didn't keep good record. We didn't keep any records back then of any of these things.
It was deliberate in large. There are accounts that when the Grand Lodge of England, the premier Grand Lodge, was forming, that some of the lodges who opposed the formation of the Grand Lodge destroyed records.
Absolutely.
We know that happened. We also, because they were like, I'm not going to let that Anderson guy get a hold of our good stuff.
Yeah, and there was a huge class war that was going on between the ancients and moderns. Like the moderns were sort of the aristocrats, and the ancients were laborers and middling class, and
Irish.
And exactly, and Irish, very Irish, and that was a big part of what was going on. There was socio-political stuff going on, there was religious stuff going on, and the schism had a lot more to do with that than hey, should we include all 3 degrees, including the 4th? Which sort of like the common thought about it, right? But it really goes deeper than that.
And there, given all of that, the destruction of records, I have always argued that one of the great gifts that was given to Freemasonry, as frustrating as it is in some ways, but that one of the great gifts that was given to Freemasonry is that we don't know our origin, because that gives every Master Mason the freedom to find in the fraternity what he's looking for, and denies to our hierarchy the ability to impose the meaning of the fraternity on us. And that is a great gift. It comes at a cost, and the cost is sometimes not being able to figure out what stuff like this means, which is very frustrating. And I implore you to please solve the mystery, because I'm one of those people. This will periodically return to me, usually when I'm trying to fall asleep and bother me.
Yeah, it's troublesome. And as I said, I've spent a few years cracking on it. My hope is that to get the academic version of this work published soon, and I might. But mostly the idea there isn't that I'll have the solution, but it will bring the proper attention to the manuscript from the real historians out there that might have access to documents that I don't. I definitely need to give a lot of credit to Andreas Onefors and to Joseph Wages, who have given me access to unpublished sources that they allowed me to cite, that allowed me to really pull back my original hypothesis and get the date really locked in on this. So
it does work on it. I think it's amazing. But the fact that the fact that we don't know how it fits together is very intriguing to me.
Yeah,
I mean, some people may be intrigued by the Premier Grand Lodge. Some people may be intrigued by the ritual history. I just want to know what these documents what these pieces had to do with each other that they ended up in one document.
Exactly. And that's a big portion of deciphering the meaning behind this, you know, the why of all of our proposed questions at the beginning of the discussion is why. Like, why is this encrypted? Why is it written? What is it? Is it a personal journal? Is it the ramblings of a madman? Obviously not, because there's a lot of like really distinct correlations to things that say this guy experienced stuff, knew about it, the timeline's right, the time that this stuff is happening all relates to the entire third section of this. Makes a ton of sense. Section 1 in and of itself kind of makes sense with this Oculus thing. Section 2 is super weird. And why are these three things together? That's the real question, you know.
Yeah, I do feel like this is possibly a very idiosyncratic, you know, it's some guy's stuff that he chose to jot down in his weird stuff journal.
It could be. It could be. Maybe his third weird stuff journal.
Yeah, if somebody ever opens up one of the journals that I've kept over the course of years, it might not look entirely dissimilar, except for the encryption won't be as good.
Well, my handwriting being what it is might be considered to be a cipher. So.
What is that letter? Yeah, this is the fact that we don't have good records makes me sad. It makes me almost as sad every time I think about how the Lodge of Alexandria. No, the library of Alexandria was burned down, and it just makes me almost cry every time.
Yeah, you know, we lost a lot along the course of years, and we're losing more every day. You know, Keith McKinnon, who's the curator of the Cambridge Masonic Temple, on numerous occasions, Keith has put out a new item, some artifact of Masonry. You know, and I've looked at it and been intrigued and said, Keith, where did you get that from? And I'm amazed at the number of times he says, I rescued it from a dumpster.
Yeah. That is.
It was closing and they were cleaning it out or whatever. And all the stuff ended up in a dumpster. And, you know, Keith dives in and pulls it out and saves it. And I know there's Keiths all over the country who are doing the same. But they're just not enough of them.
There's a bunch of dusty libraries in Berlin that documents like this might be still sitting on, for all we know.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of libraries that used to exist that might have had them that are now gone. Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us, as frustrating as I have found.
Well, I'm hopeful I shed at least a little light and opened up a new avenue of inquiry for you and anyone else who reads it. And
it's fascinating stuff. It really is.
Yeah. I really, it's kind of fascinating that it has been so overlooked, considering how new it is and how much interesting information is in there. And my hope is to just get a little bit more focus on it, so that other researchers can bring their research to the table and find some more sources that correlate, and see if we can't put the story together and let you sleep at night.
Yeah, sleeping at night would be good. So I do want to ask you one more thing. You're, and this is completely unrelated, but you're one of the founding wardens of a brand new lodge, right?
I am.
What has that experience been like of founding a new lodge? Not many people can.
It's had its ups and downs. It's been challenging. It's a lot like starting a business. It's a lot like running a startup. You have a lot of similar challenges, like not a lot of money in the bank. But as a volunteer organization, you can't be, a person who just spearheads the whole thing. You need everybody to pitch in. But by and large, it's been a lot of fun, and we've done a lot of cool work together and raised some money for some good causes, and had a lot of great festive boards, and defined and added to, the opening ceremonies before we open lodge, and really put an emphasis on mindfulness. We meditate before every lodge meeting. It's a guided meditation by Doug Russell, who's part of the Academy of Reflection from Guthrie. So it's been really good, and honestly, the article that was published in the Journal of the Masonic Society goes into the whys and hows of chartering what we call a micro lodge or a smaller lodge, and the advantages that has, and how the Grand Lodge of California has really supported the endeavor quite a bit. So if all things go well, November 2nd, we'll receive our charter.
And you said it's a micro lodge, it's a smaller lodge. Why did you feel like you wanted to start that small lodge?
There's a lot. It's a lot easier to do a couple of things really well with a couple of people than to do a lot of things really well with a lot of people.
My experience is it's very hard to do anything well with a lot of people.
That's true. Yeah, exactly. So we basically put forth an entire statement of purposes and branding and concept and the whole list of here's what we're thinking about doing. Do you want to get on board? And people got on board. The first time I tried to do this, we had a more democratic approach. It didn't really work. It totally foundered and fell apart. It was like no one could commit to an idea, and we argued about it, and it just sunk. And when a cohesive concept was put together by a couple of people, we got buy-in a lot more quickly. And since everyone bought in, it's like we know what we're doing, we want to do. We all want to do the same thing. And it's pretty easy to find 15, 20, 25 guys to get on board with a singular concept. Once you start getting past 50, even in traditional business management books, it's like when you hit 50 people from a management perspective, you need to sort of cellularize your team. You need to have sub-middle managers to manage each group of 50 as you kind of percolate out the cellular system of management. After 50, you don't know everybody's name, and it just takes a different approach. That cellular system doesn't really exist in Masonry. So when lodges get over 50, they start to fractionalize. You get cliques, you get disharmony. It is a training ground for how to figure out how to work together. I believe that a lot of Masonry is learning how to work together, but it's certainly a lot more fun and a lot easier when there's less friction.
Yeah, absolutely. My mother lodge is not a small lodge, but I am a big fan of the idea of smaller lodges. I think, a lot of lodges in Europe and in England are very tiny compared to American lodges and have really strict attendance requirements too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have like a 98% attendance rate. We often have more guests than members at a meeting, even though we're pretty much all of our members are there for the most part. So yeah, it's more to come. But yeah, if you want to learn more about the process, you can. Here's my shameless plug. FreemasonLifestyle.com. There's a great article on there. We actually, the lodge and me won a Grand Lodge Communication Award for the article. And it was featured on Freemasons for Dummies, and a lot of people took interest, and I'm hopeful that other people will pick up the charge and try doing something new. Even though we stick to everything old and keep all those traditions together, there's no reason why we can't do things a little bit differently.
Sounds great, and best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that's been 3 Distinct Knocks for tonight. Thank you so much, Bryan, for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Are you going to take us out, Nick?
Yeah, I'll take us out, the usual thing. The fantastic photography on our website is courtesy of brother Aaron Sherman. Our theme song is currently underdeveloped, but is
it's not underdeveloped.
It's not underdeveloped. Our theme song has just not been answered, but it's not anyway. By worshipful Christopher Duggan. Our website is lovingly tendered by myself. Essential Canine Supervision tonight was provided by Zach and Falula, wherever they are. The opinions expressed in this podcast and on our website and social media pages and everywhere else you find us are those of the individual contributors and do not represent the opinions of any lodge, Grand Lodge, or other Masonic body. Please visit us at 3distinctknocks.org. I'm Nicholas Harvey. I'm incredibly thankful for the brothers that have made this podcast and my journey so rich, interesting, challenging, and fulfilling. I hope 3 Distinct Knocks has... Wait, where's our... It's missing the Patreons. Thank you to all our Patreons. Sorry.
Yeah, and if you're not a Patreon, you can go to our website and find out how to be a Patreon. It's helpful to have some support for things like maintaining our website and buying Nick new equipment or whatever we end up doing with
hosting costs and
all that
kind of stuff. I hope Three Distinct Knocks has helped you make some daily progress in Freemasonry. Thank you for listening.